When a man starts thinking about you all day, one of the first things that changes is the way he looks for reasons to stay connected to you. Suddenly, communication becomes more intentional. He no longer waits only for important moments or obvious excuses to reach out. Instead, even the smallest things begin reminding him of you. And because you stay on his mind constantly, he naturally finds ways to bring himself into your world more often. At first, it may seem subtle, a random message during the day, a reaction to something small you posted, a question he could have easily ignored but chose to ask anyway. Maybe he sends you something that reminded him of you, even if it seems insignificant. But what these small moments really reveal is emotional presence. You're occupying space in his mind long enough that he feels the urge to maintain connection, even through the simplest interactions, because when someone thinks about you deeply, silence starts feeling heavier to them. A man who cannot stop thinking about you begins craving emotional closeness naturally. He wants access to your energy, your attention, your voice, your presence. And because of that, he creates opportunities to communicate instead of waiting passively for connection to happen on its own. That is where emotional attachment quietly begins revealing itself. See, people make time and effort for what emotionally occupies their mind. If someone constantly thinks about you, they become emotionally drawn toward you throughout the day. Little reminders trigger thoughts about you. Certain songs, places, conversations, or moments suddenly feel connected to your presence in his mind. And eventually those thoughts become difficult for him to keep to himself. So he reaches out, not always with dramatic confessions, but through consistency, through attention, through small actions that quietly say, "You've been on my mind." Sometimes he may not even fully realize how often he is doing it at first. It happens naturally because emotional interest creates emotional curiosity. He starts wanting to know what you are doing, how your day is going, how you are feeling emotionally. Even simple conversations become meaningful because the connection itself matters to him now. And what makes this different from surface-level attention is the emotional intention behind it. Because genuine interest is rarely random. A man who constantly thinks about you does not communicate only when convenient or out of boredom. There is effort behind his attention, consistency behind his curiosity. He remembers details you mentioned before. He follows up on things that matter to you. He notices when your energy changes. And those behaviors reveal emotional investment growing beneath the surface. Meanwhile, your absence also begins affecting him differently. If communication suddenly slows down, he notices quickly because your presence became part of his emotional routine. Silence feels unfamiliar. Distance feels noticeable. And because he is emotionally attached to your energy, he naturally feels the urge to reconnect and close that emotional gap again. That is why he starts finding little reasons to reach out more often. Not because he has nothing else to do, but because emotional attachment creates emotional toll pull. The more someone occupies your thoughts, the more your instinct pushes you toward connection with them. And perhaps the most powerful part is this. These small actions often reveal feelings long before words ever do. Because when a man truly thinks about you all day, communication stops feeling forced. It becomes natural, consistent, and emotionally intentional in ways that quietly show how deeply you are living inside his mind. And sometimes the strongest sign someone is emotionally attached to you is how often they find reasons just to hear from you again. When a man thinks about you all day, he naturally becomes more emotionally aware of you in ways that are difficult to fake. Your energy starts standing out to him more. Small changes in your mood, your behavior, your tone, or your level of attention no longer go unnoticed because emotional attachment sharpens observation. The more someone occupies your thoughts emotionally, the more closely you begin paying attention to them without even realizing it. That is why a man who truly thinks about you deeply starts noticing the little things. He notices when your energy feels different. He notices when you seem quieter than usual. He notices when your excitement fades, when your responses become shorter, or when your emotional distance subtly changes. Things other people might completely overlook suddenly feel important to him because your emotional state matters in his mind now. And that emotional attentiveness reveals genuine interest because when someone cares deeply, they naturally become curious about your world. They want to understand what affects your mood, what brings you peace, what hurts you, and what makes you happy. Your emotions stop feeling insignificant to them because they are emotionally invested in your well-being. That is the difference between surface-level attraction and deeper emotional attachment. Surface-level interest notices appearances. Genuine emotional connection notices energy. A man who constantly thinks about you begins reading between the lines emotionally. He can often sense when something feels off, even if you try not to say it directly. Maybe he notices a shift in your tone during conversation. Maybe he realizes you are less emotionally expressive than usual. Maybe he pays attention to habits, routines, or little details because your behavior genuinely stays on his mind. And what makes this powerful is that it often happens naturally. He is not forcing himself to observe you carefully. Emotional attachment creates awareness automatically. When someone matters deeply to you, your mind becomes more emotionally tuned into them. You begin paying attention because their presence emotionally affects your day too. That is why silence impacts him differently as well. If you suddenly pull away emotionally or become distant, he feels the shift quickly. Communication no longer feels routine to him. It feels emotionally important. And because he has become emotionally attached to your energy, any noticeable change creates curiosity and concern inside him. Now he starts wondering, are you okay? Did something happen? Are you upset with him? Are you slowly losing interest emotionally? Those thoughts begin growing because your emotional presence matters enough for him to notice its absence. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this. Genuine attentiveness creates emotional safety. When someone notices your emotions consistently, you feel seen, you feel emotionally important. You feel like your presence actually matters to them beyond convenience or temporary attraction. That kind of attention creates closeness because emotional connection grows strongest when people feel understood without constantly needing to explain themselves. Meanwhile, this attentiveness often changes his behavior too, becomes more careful with your feelings, more intentional with communication, more emotionally aware of how his actions affect you. Because once someone truly cares, they stop viewing your emotions as separate from their own emotional experience. And that is where deeper emotional attachment begins forming, not only through attraction or excitement, but through emotional awareness, through consistently noticing someone's energy, protecting their peace, and caring about how they feel even in the smallest moments. Because when a man thinks about you all day, your emotions stop becoming background noise in his life. They become something he naturally pays attention to. Because your happiness, your silence, and your emotional energy begin affecting his heart more deeply than he can easily ignore anymore. When a man thinks about you all day, your absence begins affecting him in ways he often does not expect at first. What once felt casual slowly becomes emotional attachment, and once that attachment forms, distance starts feeling heavier than before. Your presence becomes part of his emotional routine. Your messages, your voice, your energy, your attention. Those things quietly become woven into his daily emotional life. And the moment that connection feels interrupted, he notices it deeply. At first, he may try to ignore it. He tells himself he is simply curious about you or temporarily distracted, but then he starts checking his phone more often. He notices when you take longer to respond. He reads conversations. Little moments throughout the day suddenly feel incomplete because your energy is missing from them. And that is when he begins realizing how emotionally important you have become to him. Because when someone constantly occupies your thoughts, their absence creates his emotional noise. Silence feels louder. Distance feels more noticeable. The mind naturally keeps returning to them because emotional attachment creates emotional dependency over time. Now he starts missing things he once took for granted. The comfort of hearing from you, your presence during ordinary moments, the emotional reassurance your attention brought into his day. Even small interactions begin carrying emotional weight because your connection became meaningful to him gradually, often without him fully realizing it. That is why your silence can affect him so deeply. When communication suddenly slows down or emotional distance appears, he starts feeling unsettled. His mind searches for explanations. Did something change emotionally? Are you pulling away? Are you losing interest? Have you become emotionally tired of the connection? Those questions begin repeating because your emotional presence mattered more to him than he initially understood. And what makes this powerful is that emotional attachment often reveals itself most clearly through absence. When someone is constantly around, their value can become familiar. but distance forces emotional awareness. Suddenly, he feels the emptiness your energy used to fill naturally. He realizes how often he thought about you throughout the day, because now those thoughts are mixed with longing instead of connection. That emotional restlessness changes his behavior too. He may start looking for ways to reconnect more often. He becomes more attentive to your responses, more emotionally sensitive to changes in your energy. Even small signs from you suddenly carry emotional meaning because he is emotionally invested now. And perhaps the hardest part for him is this: he cannot easily control those thoughts anymore. When someone genuinely matters to you emotionally, your mind naturally returns to them repeatedly. Memories appear unexpectedly. Random moments trigger thoughts about them. Ordinary parts of the day feel emotionally tied to their presence because emotional attachment has already formed beneath the surface. That is why longing feels so powerful. It is not always dramatic or obvious externally, but internally it creates emotional pull. A man who thinks about you constantly begins craving emotional closeness with you, naturally. He misses your attention when it disappears. He notices the emotional shift immediately when your energy becomes distant. And through that absence, he starts understanding something important. Your presence was not ordinary to him anymore. The conversations, the attention, the emotional connection, the comfort of knowing you were there, those things became emotionally significant. And now that he feels the weight of your absence, he realizes just how deeply your energy had become part of his emotional world. Because when someone truly thinks about you all day, losing access to your presence no longer feels small. It starts feeling like something emotionally missing from their life completely. When a man thinks about you all day, something deeper slowly begins happening inside him emotionally. At first, the thoughts may feel simple: curiosity, attraction, excitement, emotional interest. But over time, when someone consistently occupies your mind and emotions, the connection naturally begins expanding beyond the present moment. He no longer thinks about you only in temporary situations. He starts imagining you as part of his future. And that shift is powerful. Because future-oriented thinking usually comes from emotional attachment, not surface-level attraction. A man who cannot stop thinking about you begins imagining experiences, memories, conversations, and moments that have not even happened yet. Your presence becomes mentally connected to his idea of comfort, happiness, and emotional peace. Now he starts picturing you in everyday parts of his life. Small things trigger future thoughts naturally. Places he wants to take you, conversations he wants to have with you, experiences he imagines sharing with you. He begins wondering what life would feel like with your consistent presence in it long term. And often, he may not even realize how emotionally invested he is becoming at first. Because these thoughts happen quietly, naturally. One moment he is simply thinking about your smile, your energy, your conversations. The next moment he is imagining future weekends together, future memories, future emotional closeness. That is how emotional attachment deepens. It slowly turns someone from part of your present into part of your emotional vision for the future. And this changes the way he treats you too. A man who sees you emotionally connected to his future becomes more intentional. He cares more about maintaining the connection. He becomes more emotionally careful with your feelings, because losing you now feels heavier emotionally than before. That emotional investment creates vulnerability, because once someone becomes part of your imagined future, the fear of losing them becomes more real too. He starts thinking about whether you feel the same connections, whether the bond between you is growing deeper, whether you see him as part of your future too. And that emotional curiosity creates stronger attachment. See, when a man constantly thinks about you, your importance in his emotional world naturally increases. You stop feeling temporary to him. You become emotionally significant. Your happiness starts mattering more. Your presence begins feeling emotionally grounding in ways that are difficult for him to ignore. That is why future-oriented thinking often reveals genuine feelings. A man who only wants temporary excitement rarely spends time imagining emotional stability, long-term closeness, or shared growth with someone. But when thoughts about you become constant, his mind naturally begins attaching emotional permanence to your presence. He starts imagining what it would feel like to wake up beside you regularly, to support you emotionally, to build memories together, to keep hearing your voice during difficult days. Your presence becomes emotionally tied to his sense of comfort and peace. And perhaps the most meaningful part is this. Future thinking often changes his priorities. He becomes more emotionally present, more attentive, more willing to invest time and energy into the connection, because he no longer sees you as someone passing briefly through his life. He begins seeing emotional potential in you. That emotional shift affects everything: the way he communicates, the way he pays attention, the way he values consistency, the way he reacts to distance or silence from you. Because once someone becomes emotionally connected to your imagined future, the relationship begins carrying deeper emotional weight naturally. And when a man truly thinks about you all day, eventually his heart stops seeing you as just part of the moment and quietly begins imagining you as part of the life he genuinely hopes to keep. When a man thinks about you all day, one of the biggest changes that begins happening is the way he becomes more emotionally protective and caring toward you. Because genuine emotional attachment naturally creates responsibility in the heart. The more someone matters to you emotionally, the more their peace, happiness, and emotional well-being begin affecting you personally. And that changes his behavior in subtle but powerful ways. He starts paying closer attention to how you feel. Your stress matters to him. Your sadness affects him. Your happiness genuinely makes him feel lighter emotionally. He becomes more intentional with his actions because your emotional world no longer feels separate from his own. That is what emotional attachment does. It creates care that goes beyond attraction. A man who constantly thinks about you does not only crave your attention, he starts wanting to protect your peace too. He wants to know you are okay. He wants you to feel emotionally supported, emotionally valued, emotionally safe around him. And you can feel the difference in the way he treats you. His words become more thoughtful. His attention becomes more consistent. He starts remembering things that matter to you because your emotions stay present in his mind throughout the day. Even small details about your comfort begin carrying emotional importance to him, because once someone deeply occupies your heart and thoughts, hurting them stops feeling easy. Now he becomes more aware of how his behavior affects you emotionally. He notices when you seem overwhelmed, distant, tired, or emotionally drained. And instead of ignoring those shifts, he feels naturally drawn toward helping, supporting, or comforting you in some way. That emotional protectiveness is not about control. It is about care. A man who genuinely thinks about you constantly often wants to make your life feel emotionally lighter, not heavier. He wants his presence to bring comfort instead of confusion. And because your happiness emotionally matters to him now, he becomes more intentional about maintaining emotional closeness and trust between you. That is why consistency often increases too. He checks in more. He communicates more thoughtfully. He becomes more emotionally reliable because emotional attachment creates emotional responsibility. Your connection no longer feels casual to him. It feels valuable. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that this caring energy often appears naturally without performance. He may not always express it through dramatic declarations. Sometimes it reveals itself through small actions. Asking if you got home safely. Remembering something important you mentioned days earlier. Noticing when your mood changes. Trying to make your difficult days easier emotionally. Those little moments reveal genuine affection more than grand words often do. Because real care shows itself consistently through attention and emotional presence. Meanwhile, his protective instincts also grow stronger emotionally. He becomes more aware of things that could hurt you emotionally because he no longer wants to be another source of pain in your life. Instead, he wants to become someone you can emotionally trust. And that desire usually comes from deep emotional investment. A man who constantly thinks about you begins imagining your emotional well-being as connected to his own happiness too. Your peace brings him peace. Your smile affects his mood. Your emotional closeness becomes something he values deeply and wants to preserve carefully. That is why genuine emotional attachment changes someone's priorities naturally. They stop acting only for themselves emotionally. They start considering how their choices affect the person they care about deeply. And through that emotional awareness, their actions become softer, kinder, more intentional. Because when a man truly thinks about you all day, eventually his heart stops wanting only your attention and starts wanting to protect the emotional peace connected to your presence in his life. No matter how hard someone tries to hide genuine feelings, emotional attachment eventually begins revealing itself through behavior. Because when a man thinks about you all day, his actions slowly start exposing emotions that words alone could never fully conceal. At some point, the connection becomes too emotionally strong to remain invisible. You begin noticing it in the consistency, not occasional attention, not random moments of interest that disappear quickly, but repeated effort, repeated curiosity, repeated emotional presence. He keeps finding ways to stay connected to you because your presence continuously occupies his thoughts and emotions. And that emotional consistency is difficult to fake for long because people naturally invest time, energy, and attention into what emotionally matters to them. A man who constantly thinks about you begins prioritizing communication differently. He notices your moods more. He remembers small details. He reacts to your absence more strongly. He becomes emotionally affected by your happiness, your silence, and your energy in ways that reveal deeper attachment beneath the surface. At first, he may try to appear casual. Maybe he avoids directly confessing his feelings. Maybe he hides behind humor, friendship, or subtle gestures, but emotions always find ways to leak into behavior eventually. The heart reveals itself through patterns long before words fully explain what someone feels. That is why his actions start becoming more intentional. He makes time for you even when life gets busy. He checks in on you naturally. He becomes more emotionally available, more attentive, more emotionally responsive to changes in your energy. And often, he starts doing these things instinctively because emotional attachment creates emotional pull. Your presence begins influencing his emotional world deeply. Now your silence affects his mood. Your happiness brings him peace. Your distance creates emotional restlessness. And because he constantly thinks about you, his behavior slowly begins revolving around maintaining emotional closeness with you. That is where genuine feelings become impossible to fully hide. Because love changes priorities, a man who once acted detached may suddenly become more emotionally consistent, more patient, more caring, more vulnerable. He may start opening up emotionally in ways he usually avoids because thinking about you constantly softens emotional walls over time. And perhaps the most powerful part is this. Genuine feelings reveal themselves most clearly through repeated actions, not dramatic words. Anyone can say beautiful things in emotional moments, but consistency tells the truth. Effort tells the truth. Emotional attentiveness tells the truth. The willingness to remain present emotionally, even during ordinary moments, reveals real emotional investment. That is why actions matter more than temporary intensity. A man who truly thinks about you deeply will naturally keep showing up emotionally. He will keep finding ways to stay connected, protect the bond, and maintain emotional closeness because his feelings are influencing his behavior consistently from the inside. Meanwhile, you also begin feeling the emotional sincerity behind his actions. You notice the effort becoming natural instead of forced, the attention becoming steady instead of unpredictable, the emotional care becoming visible in small moments, not only big emotional conversations. And through those repeated behaviors, trust begins forming because consistency creates emotional security. That is how genuine emotional attachment reveals itself over time. Not always through immediate confessions, but through patterns of care, emotional presence, vulnerability, and consistent attention that become impossible to ignore. Eventually, the feelings become visible because the heart always expresses itself through action when someone truly matters deeply enough. Because when a man thinks about you all day, sooner or later his behavior begins telling the emotional truth his words may still be trying to hide.